Hey, this is Greg, and welcome to this tutorial on the Puppet Warp tool inside of Adobe Photoshop. So in this tutorial, we're going to go over maybe some of the traditional ways you can use the Puppet Warp tool, but then also a way you maybe haven't thought of that you can use the Puppet Warp tool. All right, so let's start with this photo here of this diver. Now this is just a stock image, so I have no idea whether this is a composite image. This is not something I will be trying, but let's look at this image right here. So I'll just come in here a little bit. And so let's say we want to manipulate this photo and we want to make it look like he hasn't made the dive yet. He's still standing on this cliff. Now the name Puppet Warp sort of gives away what the tool can do. So if you think of a puppet, you have strings attached to rotation points, and you can use those strings to move an individual rotation points or multiple rotation points. And so the Puppet Warp tool is going to work much the same way, but let's dig into this and let's see some of the things you have to understand and some of the things you have to watch for when using the Puppet Warp tool. So inside this document here, I have a couple layers, and so what I've done here is, let me just go and show you here. So on this original bottom layer here, let me just zoom out and fit this to screen for a moment so we can see the whole thing. So this original bottom layer, the image itself wasn't quite tall enough, and so I've come in here and I've added another layer where I added in the top of that background just so his head won't go off the screen if I have him up here on top of the cliff. And then also in here I've added a layer where I just sort of masked out the person, and I did that of course just using the spot healing brush. That's a real easy fix because there's not a lot of detail in here. So I'll have other tutorials on the channel if you want to check out things like that, so look for those things coming. But what I did was I just masked out the person there, and then of course before I did that I really cut him out and I put him on his own layer. So if I sort of Alt Option over to this layer here, I can see that that is just him isolated by himself. So by the way, if you use Alt or Option key and you click on that little eyeball icon of an individual layer, you can see just that layer, and then when you Alt Option again, it's going to turn all the layers back on. So that's very helpful rather than going through and trying to turn all these off. You can see one layer just by holding down Alt or Option, and then boom, you can see that Alt or Option, then you can bring back all those layers that were just turned on. So I have him isolated on a layer here. I'm also going to come in here and I'm going to hit Control J just to copy him, because I do find it is helpful to always have a non-destructive workflow. So in case I mess him up and I want to go back to this original diver, I have him on another layer here. But let me just hit Alt and get back to that bottom layer here. So something you have to know when you're working on the Puppet Warp tool, it is going to work on whatever active layer you're on. So if I come down to this layer here and I try to work on him, I'm no longer working on just him, because remember he's isolated up on this person copy layer, but he is not isolated down here on this layer. So let's just see what would happen if I came in here now. So if I come in under my edit menu, that's how you get to the Puppet Warp tool. So I'll choose edit and then I'll go down to Puppet Warp. I'll select Puppet Warp. And so in here, what you do is you see this mesh sometimes. Now you can turn that on and off with this show mesh. And then when you have it turned on, you have this expansion, which basically makes it so your sort of mesh goes beyond your subject if you raise that up, or you could sort of shrink it in. Now a good default setting is just setting this back to 0. You can play with that if you want to, but a lot of times I will just have it set to 0. So let me try that again. 0, just set that back to 0. And mesh, again, you can turn that on and off. Sometimes I have it on. You don't always need it on. You can turn that on and off. And then the other thing here, a couple of the other settings, you have normal mode, rigid, distort. I'm not going to talk about that too much. Usually you'll probably work in normal mode, but you can fool around and see with the other modes, whether they're helpful. We're going to work in normal mode today. And density controls to how many pins you put down. So if I show this mesh here, and I have my density set to fewer points, you can see how there's less points on the mesh. And so if I were to go and right now, you'll see this pin icon anytime you're over the image. And if you just tap on it, it's going to put down a point. Now if I were to try to put down a point in this same area here, I can do that, but if I start to put a couple in here, it's going to tell me cannot add a new pin because it is too close to an existing pin. To increase the number of available points, choose density and more points. In other words, you can come in here and you can change this density and make more of a fine mesh, and then you can come in here and you can add pins that are a little closer together. Now there are still limits, as you can see here, but let me just delete all these pins here. And if you want to just select a pin, you just click on it, right? And you click on it and you can drag it around and you can delete it. But let me just hold on, let me just turn it off. So the point I wanted to make here with this, since we have everything on one layer, now as we do this, you can click a pin And the pin is either adding as an anchor to hold things in place so they won't move, or it's a point you can drag from. And so since everything is part of the same layer, I'm manipulating the whole layer here, right? Because it's all the pixels that are on that layer. We don't have the subject isolated. So this is not going to be what we want for this example, but I just wanted to show in here, come here and show you that, and then also go over some of these options. So more points lets you put down even more of these control points. If you have the density to more points, you can start with it on normal. Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes you only need a few points and it's going to work a little bit better. All these options up here in the options bar, it just takes a little bit of experimenting around and figuring out what works best for a given image, and you'll get to used to the settings and see what works for you. But again, you can come in here and you can add pins on here. So let me just hit enter. So that's, and then you can add pins, and then you can of course use that pin as a control point to either hold something in place or drag it around and manipulate it. And then when you're done, you go ahead and hit enter and it commits those changes. Now, of course, I do not want to commit what I just did there, so I'm going to hit Control Z just to undo that. So once you get out of it, it's just one step to undo everything you just did. Okay, so this is where isolating the layer you want to work on can become really important, and you'll see in a future example here why it's even more important. Can be even more important. So anyways, here on this layer here, remember this layer, this person layer up here, just has the subject isolated. So for starters, we might just want to move them up to the cliff top, and also I'm going to turn this back on because that is my layer here that adds a little more sky at the top. And then above that, we have this layer here, which gets rid, this layer gets rid of the subject. So I've erased them out here, and then the layers above it is a person, and then just a copy. I just wanted to have a copy. So let's take this copy here, and so I could start by just doing something simple with like a Control T. Maybe I'll put this anchor point by his feet, and I'm just going to spin him up, and we're going to start to put him in position to where we want. This is your rotation point here, this little center thing. So in other words, if I put this over here, I don't know if you've ever worked with this control point here, but if it shows you where the anchor point is going to be for your rotation. So if I were to rotate him now, look, I can make him rotate around that center axis. So if you're ever doing something where you're like, okay, I want his feet to be the point where I'm rotating around, then I would drag that anchor point right up to his feet, and then I can sort of manipulate it that way. So that's another good tip built in here. Something to know when you're working with that transform, and that's Control T, Command T to get into transform, enter to commit or changes. So we have him in the basic position we want. Now I'll go ahead and zoom in here. We'll get zoomed all the way in. Now we can come in here and we can just start to manipulate this. He's going to be standing out here, but again, it's not going to look right with his feet pointed down like that. I don't want him to be on his tiptoes. I don't want his back to be quite so arched. So this is something where, remember that Puppet Warp tool lets you come in here and sort of define an armature or skeletal structure by putting down those control points. So whenever you have something like this where you have a subject and you want to move an arm, you want to move a leg, you can come in here and do that. Now, I'll also mention, if you have something where you just wanted to manipulate someone's arm, you could consider, if it was isolated within the image, cutting that out first. That way you're working just on the arm and not the rest of the body. In this example here, I think, especially since we're going to be zoomed out a little bit looking at the final image, I think we can get away with just having the subject isolated from the background. So what I'm going to do now is I'll go ahead and hit, actually I'll zoom in here even more just so we're, here's one thing to mention. Once you go into the Puppet Warp tool, you're sort of stuck at whatever zoom you were at when you entered in there. So I'm going to zoom into 200% just so I can really see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to come under the edit menu, making sure I'm on that layer I want to work on, edit Puppet Warp. Okay, so here we are again, this expansion, for some reason it's resetting for me. I'm just going to put that back to 0. This usually isn't going to come into play, but if you notice something funny going on, you can experiment with that. And again, you can experiment with the densities, other things. I'm not going to worry about those. I think those default settings are going to work fine. I don't even think I need to see the mesh. Sometimes the mesh can be distracting. It can be helpful sometimes, but I'm going to leave that turned off. So what I want to think about here is what I want to pivot and what do I want to keep as it is. So I might want them standing up more straight. So if I just put down one anchor point, and then a second one up here, then I can just rotate around that bottom without distorting his body first. So one tip I'll give you is think about if you have to make multiple manipulations, sometimes you want to do some of them before you start adding in even more control points. And just to show you why, because if I come down here and let's say I had one at his knees, now suddenly that's coming into play when I start to move this control handle. So if I just delete this first, delete, I can go ahead and make this edit first, just having them stand up a little bit more straight. And then I can start to add some more control points. And all this just takes practice and experimenting around. And this is why it's good to make a copy of your layer, because if you mess it up completely, you can always hit Control Z, but then you also have that copy below if you want to get back to where you started. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do here is I want him being straighter, be standing up straighter. So let's try to bring it so he's a little bit more in a standing position. Leaning forward is fine, but a little bit more in a standing position. So actually, let me first get rid of this one first, delete. And let's just bring it, him back until his legs are a little bit more straight. And then we'll add in that point. And then we'll bring the top of his body, because again, I do want him leaning forward like he's about to dive, but a little bit more straight than he was originally. So there's that. I'm going to have to manipulate his feet. His head I might want to manipulate. So you're trying to think of what the rotation points would be normally. So this really isn't going to rotate, or that's not going to rotate. And again, you can easily mess something up and have it look awkward. That's just why you just have to play around with this and take your time and work on things slowly, and then don't be afraid to undo. If you click on a control point and then hit delete, you can delete it. So again, take your time with this. And so then I'm going to come in here, and what I really want to do is I want to take this control point and I want to delete that. Maybe no, because if I delete that, then it reverts back to where it was originally. So I'm going to hit Control Z. I want to keep that, but I want to start to bring his foot up. Before I do that, I want to take this other one here, and I want to maybe have one here. So again, this just takes practice to start to figure out what is going to look okay, and you can easily end up with something that looks really weird, right? So again, all of this, I think, is getting closer. Whoops. And as you get more and more control points in here, it gets harder and harder to get something that's not going to look really funky. Now, I think maybe that's enough rotation, because then I can rotate the whole thing again once I commit the changes. So if I hit enter now his legs do look a little wonky, but I don't know if I'm going to notice if I'm zoomed out. So I think the one leg here, I maybe went a little too far. Maybe that needs to be bumped out a little bit, but I don't know if I'm going to totally worry about that in this tutorial. Again, know what your final result needs to be, and then work with that in mind. So then I'll put this down here. Again, I want them standing up a little bit straighter. That's probably good. And then I want them standing maybe right about here. And so just to sell this a little bit better, I would probably do something like come in here. I'll grab some black, have my flow down a decent amount, and then there would just be some sort of shadow. So I'm working under him here just to put a shadow that's sort of where his feet are. And again, I don't think I've done a great job here. Like maybe I would spend a little bit more time getting that to look right. But again, if I zoom out, I think it's enough to sell it, just because I envision the photo being out like this. And so again, this is just how you would go about using the Puppet Warp tool for something like that, where here was the original here, this here, and then we've changed it now to where he's standing on the cliff. And again, take as much time as you need. You can do a better job than I did right there. And again, it's easy for things to get a little wonky, so you're not going to be able to pull off miracles with every photo, but you really can do a lot. You would be surprised what you can do if you take your time, and especially also if you remember what pixels are on that layer. Maybe you need to cut out the arm first, have that on its own layer, and work on that separately. Now let's go through another example. So this is maybe one way that you would use it, typically thinking of like an armature, a skeletal structure where you want to manipulate points. You can use it to unbend objects, to add a bend to an object. Let me come back over to this image here. Here's another example. Now let's look at this guy's shirt here. Now something like this, if you wanted to remove the wrinkle, in the center of the shirt, sort of that fold in the center of the shirt. Now I know a lot of times you might use something like the liquify tool, you might use something like frequency separation to try to get rid of that shadow more easily while you're not also damaging the pixels and the colors here. But this is something where instead of using that liquify tool, if you wanted to sort of unify these stripes and try to make it look like there isn't a fold in the shirt, this is something where you could try the puppet warp tool. So let's do that. So I'm going to hit Control J. Again, just giving myself a copy here because it's good to have a copy. That way if you mess something up, you can go back. Again, it's working on the pixels that are on your active layer. So I don't actually want all these pixels. I want to have sort of the edge of the shirt defined here. So I won't be perfect here for this tutorial purposes, but I'm going to come in here with my pen tool. I'm just going to create a pretty decent selection that just sort of gives me the edge of this shirt. Now again, I don't need to be perfect, but there's Control Enter, and then I'll just hit Control J, and with that Control J, all I've done is copied the selected pixels, and I have them up on a new layer. Okay, so now, Puppet Warp. What I want to do is try to unify these stripes. Now you could do this with the liquify tool, you'd have to freeze some things, you'd come here and you move it around, but I think in this instance, it might be even easier with the Puppet Warp tool, and it's another case of when you have multiple ways of doing something in Photoshop, you can start to fool around and figure out what strategy and what method works for you, which can be very helpful. It's always good to have multiple tools in your tool bag. So again here, I'll just go Edit. I will choose Puppet Warp, and it shows me the mesh. I'm going to hide the mesh. Expansion, I'm not even going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to put pins here on this side. Now sometimes if you're using a stylus like I will, sometimes it will move that accidentally when you first put down these pins. So I'm trying to put them down without moving the pixels from where they initially were on this side, because I just want to anchor this side. I'm putting these pins because I want to anchor the stripes on this side, but now on this side what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in pins, and then I'm just going to come and I'm going to start to drag it over and give myself a little bit of overlap, stretch it a little bit, and just try to get it so for the most part I can use these pins to line up the stripes. And now again, this is something that you can do with the liquify tool, something like this, but I think this method might be even quicker and easier. So then if I did that, I would go ahead and hit Enter to commit my changes, and so that has allowed me to line up the stripes. Of course, you would need something else to come in here. Again, like I said, some people would clean this up with frequency separation or something like that. I'm just going to come above everything and take my spot healing brush, and then I'm going to start to go over sample all layers, yes, because I want it to pull from the pixels below. And I'm just going to come in here and start to sort of, now that I have it matched up, come in here and try to get rid of that seam that you would not see, that edge. So come in here, and again, this isn't going to be perfect. Oops, because I'm just trying to do this quickly for this tutorial. So whenever you're doing something like this, take as much time as you need to get the result that works, that you're happy with. For this tutorial purposes, I'm going pretty quickly. I would maybe take a little bit more time normally, but again, you also have to remember, like, what's the final use for this image? If it's something where people are going to be scaled out, they're not going to be in looking at this level of detail, then you actually have to do less work to sell the fake. I mean, that really is what it's about. You don't want people to see your Photoshop work. You're basically coming in here and selling the fake. Now, I might do some other things, like there is some color differences here where you might try to come in here and make it so you're getting rid of some of that. Again, I'm just using spot healing brush. I'm not going to come in here and fool around with that too much. Well, again, I would just come in here and just try to make this cover a little bit more. And you could also, there are other tools you could do here. For example, you could do the clone stamp tool, set the flow to something a little less. Again, having it work on current and below. Actually, I would want it to be all layers in this case. And so maybe I would sample this white color here, and then I'm just sort of painting over a little bit of that shadow area, like right here. Paint over some of that shadow area, paint over the shadow area. And again, I have my flow set down so I'm not totally just copying pixels. I'm partially copying pixels. So anyways, I'm not going to spend any more time because you get the idea. But so let me just group all these together. So I'm just going to go Control G to group those, and then we can see there's before, there's after. Before, after. Here, I'll zoom in a little closer so we can see there's before, there's after. So we were able to come in here and take that fold out of that shirt pretty quickly, relatively effectively. And again, we used the Puppet Warp tool, where traditionally I've seen people use Liquify for that, but I think Puppet Warp is another nice tool to have in your bag. Now I'm going to show you one more example here, and this is for maybe anyone who's doing something like fantasy map making, but I can see how you could use this for lots of different things. So this technique I'm going to show you goes beyond this, but if anybody wants a longer tutorial on this specific method, just check the link up in the upper right, because I did a full tutorial on this, but let me just show you. And at the heart of this tutorial here is knowing that Puppet Warp works on the layer you're working on, and it matters greatly whether you have connected pixels or whether they're not connected and they have areas of transparency in between them. So let me just come in here, my select tool, let me find this layer. So forest, let me go down to my forest layer, forest, a copy. Okay, so this layer here is forest A, and if I alt click on this layer here, you can see that that is isolated by itself. It just has these trees. And then notice in between the trees how there's areas of transparency. That is going to be very, very important. Remember in the diver example when I just worked on the whole image with the background also still there, everything was getting manipulated. But because this is isolated, it's only going to manipulate these trees. And because the trees within this layer are isolated, watch what you can do. So I'm just going to hit Alt click to turn everything back on, but we are on this forest layer. I'll zoom in a little bit more so we can see this. I'm going to hit Edit. I'm going to choose Puppet Warp. So where's my Puppet Warp? I have lost it because I have this layer linked, I think. Let me turn that off. Edit Puppet Warp. So if you have linked layers or something like that, it could throw that off. But so now I have my Puppet Warp. Watch what I can do. I'm just going to click on any of these trees and move it. Because it's not connected pixel-wise with anything else, when I move it, I can move it completely independently. Here's one where two trees are connected, so they will move together. So keep that in mind. This is helpful. It's letting you know how this tool is moving. So if I wanted some trees over on this side, so this allows me to very quickly come in here and manipulate all these trees, rebuild my forest and my layout, without actually redrawing all these trees. You could use other methods where you selected a tree, you copied it. You could do the Alt trick where you Alt copy something. However, as you're doing that, it would start to separate it out into different layers. This is not putting these on different layers. I am just automatically on the fly using the Puppet Warp tool, manipulating these within the layer. And then once I hit Enter, it's going to commit those changes, and I've totally reorganized that layer, but it's still just the one layer. And again, that's Puppet Warp. I haven't seen anybody else using Puppet Warp this way, but it's just from playing around you find these methods, and they can be really helpful. So that's the Puppet Warp tool inside of Photoshop. I encourage you to try it out. If you like this video, please give me a subscribe. Look for more tutorials like this. And in the comments below, just let me know your favorite tool in Photoshop and any Puppet Warp tricks that you have. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.